everyone. All right, thanks you guys so much for coming out tonight. Welcome. My name is Jacob. I am a bookseller here at Labyrinth Books, and just welcome you all to this hybrid event. So hello to you online as well. Thank you for tuning in. I just have a few quick housekeeping things, and we'll move this right along. Firstly, there will be a Q&A portion at the end of the discussion here. And at that point, we'll bring a microphone to you if you raise your hand, and then you can ask your question. You have to take your mask off then, but we ask that you keep them on for the duration of the event. That'd be great. As to you online folks, there's a button you'll see toward the bottom of your screen that is labeled Ask a Question, and you can use that to ask a question. And you can do it during any time, so just click that button, and we'll go back and forth at the end between the online questions and questions in the room. And with that, I would just like to also say that you can buy Jordan's book. You can also buy it online. You can buy it right over there here in the store. It's a wonderful, wonderful tale. I highly recommend it. I would just like to say a quick shout out to our co-sponsors tonight, which include the Lewis Arts Center, the Portuguese and Spanish department at Princeton, also the journalism program at Princeton. I'll help get the word out. So we really appreciate it. So thank you guys for your continued support. It's a great little symbiotic community we got going. I'd also like to say a few words about our presenters tonight. Firstly, we have Professor Lemonick back in the store. He was actually at our first reading since the troubles began. He is, or was, the longtime editor for the opinion section of Scientific American. He was also the author of several books. One I particularly enjoy called Other Worlds, The Search for Life in the Universe, which I do also really recommend. He's a storied journalist and science writer, and it really is nice to have him back in the store to talk to a former student. As you know, that former student is Jordan Salama here in the store. His work is in National Geographic. It's been featured in the New York Times, and it's also, you can find some excerpts from this very book on Atlas Obscura if you're ever out venturing there. And as some of you know, he did graduate Princeton in 2019. And this whole event is a little trippy for me too, because I introduced the C.K. Williams reading series where the seniors come and read from their thesis here, where Jordan read from this very work one night 3 years ago in this very spot. So it's a nice little cyclical storytelling we got. I remember, you do a lot of C.K. Williams readings. It's a long-running series, and you hear from many senior students reading from the theses. And honestly, it kind of blurs together at a certain point. But I remember Jordan's. I remember getting excerpts from this book and being, I remember this. It's stuck in my mind, and I think that is a great testament to his work and its staying power. I remember even then, it wasn't just a travel diary. It wasn't vacation slides. It was a real serious, almost anthropological study for himself and for others. It was him exploring these nations and these people, and also himself and what he found on all the layers there. And a little bit more about the book. So it's called Every Day the River Changes, and ostensibly it's just about Jordan's 4 weeks traveling down the Magdalena River. Not surprisingly, the narrative expands out from there as he talks with people from all walks of life and all kinds of situations up and down the river. It kind of becomes more of like a series of ethnographies. It's really becomes this kind of window into a world, or part of the world that, especially here in America, I feel like we only get little snippets of, like either political unrest and drug cartels and FARC and all that. And actually, kind of into one of my favorite parts of the book is actually the maps that are in the book, which take on this fantasy Tolkien-esque quality. They're filled with hobbits and dragons and mystery and gold, and I feel like that's kind of indicative of the way, at least up to a point, Columbia has been portrayed to a lot, particularly Westerners like myself, kind of this land of fantasy with either hidden treasure and wild jungles and monsters and cartoon drug dealers, and it's lingered in that kind of fantasy world, particularly because, as Jordan points out, these stereotypes exist because up to a point, the accounts of Columbia and the river itself are given to us by, at best, aloof anthropologists, and at worst case, conquering conquistadors. And it's this knowledge, as eye toward history, his ability to look back to the past and to the present and to the future while he's there, that I think really makes, as John McPhee himself said, makes Jordan a born journalist. And it's with this eye toward the people, toward the river, toward himself, most importantly, and his interactions within that ecosystem, his awareness of his own place within all these points, really makes what this sort of the Everyday the River Changes really something special to read. So I really enjoyed it and recommend it. And thank you. And without further ado, let's welcome back to the store for the second time, Jordan Salama and Professor Lemonick.
That was amazing.
Yeah, he stole half my material. That's okay.
I don't think I have anything to talk about.
Thank you.
So several years ago, I can never remember what year it was. This guy walked into my class, Jordan Salama, and we looked at each other and we said, "I swear I know you from somewhere." And we tried to figure it out, and ultimately, I don't think we did know each other. We never figured it out. But it could be that that we recognize in each other two people who love narrative, nonfiction narratives that delve deeply into a subject or a place or a little of both. And so maybe that was it. And I should tell you that it's always tempting to claim that thanks to my influence, he became a very successful writer very quickly after leaving Princeton. And that would be a lie in any case, because that's never the truth. But it's even more a lie because this was not a writing course. Jordan took a course that I co-taught on climate change and how to talk about climate change in video format. So I don't even know.
Well, Mike is leaving out is that he was then afterwards my editor for 2 years at Scientific American and helped me publish some of the pieces that have meant the most to me. So I owe a lot to Mike.
Right. Well, right. No, so I do. Yeah, I do recognize a talented writer when I see one. I will admit it. And it's true that Jordan came to me a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, I think, after he left Princeton and while I was still at Scientific American, and proposed some essays related to all sorts of subjects that he was interested in. And as an editor, I have to be tough. It's like, I don't care if I know you. If your stuff is crappy, I'm going to tell you it's crappy. But I didn't have to tell you because your ideas were great and the execution was great. The latest one was a sort of a meditation on 24 hours he spent on an island that almost nobody knows exists. Is that true? No, maybe the latest one was about this book.
No, the latest one was about the island.
The island,
Island in New York.
in Long Island Sound, right, very close to New York City. And it was just lovely, and I and my colleagues really enjoyed it. And Jordan's been out back to visit my writing class, not the other class, several times. Several times? He came a couple of years.
Yeah, twice.
And the students have really responded to his pieces on the people who go shark fishing on the shores of Long Island Sound, and many other things that I can't bring to mind at the moment. Anyway, enough about this. Let me ask you the first question, and let me actually talk for one more second. It became more. This book reminded me that people in the U.S., the Eastern U.S., we're all oriented toward Europe, and people go to Europe on vacation, and they know about European history, and you name any of the 15 longest rivers in Europe, and we've heard of them. And yet South America is just as close, but closer in parts, and there's just very little attention paid to it, to the history and to the culture. As the introduction mentioned, we hear about drug wars, we hear about drug wars, and yet there's this whole continent with this rich cultural history that's has both to do with the conquistadors and the people who came in from Spain and Portugal to colonize, but also the indigenous people who still live there. One of my students this year, her family comes from Peru, I believe, and her mother's a native speaker of Quechua, thank you, which is the language of the Incas, as I understand it. And yet we don't talk about it much, we don't hear about it much. And so that was just one of many reasons that I found this book so delightful. And you should buy it, because if you buy it here, you can get it signed. This is not inconsiderable
Well-known secret.
benefit, yes. Anyway, so let me ask you, some people I think here know the story, but some don't, and people in the audience might not know the story on Zoom. How does a Princeton undergraduate or a recent Princeton graduate end up writing an entire book about a journey down the most significant river in Colombia, which most people in the US have never heard?
Yeah, that's the key question with this book, and I think that it was a series of coincidences. The way that I ended up in Colombia was a surprise. When I was a freshman here, I knew that I wanted to do something after my freshman year in Latin America, and I knew that I was interested in storytelling and in the environment, and I had an opportunity to work with,
No, go ahead.
With the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is an international wildlife organization, but I didn't know where I was going to go. And then one day I got a phone call saying, Colombia. Now, when I then heard that I had an opportunity that I could go work in Colombia for a month, people reacted in very many different ways. Everybody from those who were very worried for me because of what was said about different stereotypes and reputations that have been kind of festered in the US media for a long time. But also, there was one person in my life who was not that way. And this was my 5-year-old childhood piano teacher named Salama, and she's from Cali in Colombia. When I called her and I said that I was going to Colombia, she said, "Oh my God, this is amazing. You'll stay with my grandmother in her house. She will take care of you." And this is a very comforting thing. So I'm thinking, imagining this wonderful homestay with a sprightly grandmother in her house. I show up and she's the kindest woman in the world, but she's 96 years old and she can't get out of bed. And she, she was a very gracious host in many ways. We would talk about our days at the end over shared dinners of pasta. But at night, at 7 p.m., she would lock the door and she wouldn't let me leave. So there I was. I didn't bring my phone either to Colombia that time, which was probably not the smartest thing, but I brought this like analog phone that only people could call me on. And now that I'm thinking back to it, that was crazy. But anyway, I had no internet. I had no way of kind of being distracted. And that was the first time in those sweaty curfews after 7 p.m. in Cali when I actually started to write down journals about what I did during the day. And from those journals, I actually read here in Labyrinth, as was mentioned, kind of the first ever work that I had written about Colombia. So such that when it came time for me to pick a topic for my senior thesis here at Princeton, I looked back at those journals and recalled that everybody who I met in this vastly diverse country of people, landscapes, everybody seemed to recall that if you wanted to understand Colombia as a place, there was only one river that cut a cross-section through it all, and it was the Magdalena. And they said to understand the river is to understand the country. That's when I knew that I wanted to go back.
Okay, and did you didn't see the river on that first trip?
No, I didn't lay eye on the river. I went to Cali first, a city, and from there I did some work in some very rural areas of the country. I went to the Pacific coast where these humpback whales make these huge migrations every year. It was beautiful. I went to the northern wetlands where I stayed with a community that's doing a conservation project for endangered river turtles. I went to the Darien Gap, which is this jungle region between Colombia and Panama on the border, the only place where the Pan American Highway kind of cuts out and you can't pass. But at that time, actually still today, thousands of migrants from Haiti and Africa and South Asia were making their way on this, what was essentially a death march towards the United States through this very unforgiving jungle. So in that way, I kind of got a very initial, but I think good sampling of all of the kinds of stories and kind of socio-political issues too that Colombia has going on, and the different kinds of people who live there as well. And I knew I wanted to write about the country because I was fascinated by its history and its ever-changing present. And so then when I thought about writing about a river, I thought, well, maybe this is a good combination.
Okay, so you, in the introduction, I think, or somewhere tonight, somebody said that you spent 4 weeks there?
4 weeks down the Magdalena.
Only 4 weeks to
Yeah,
do a book like this?
yeah, and Colombia is so rich in stories that I don't think there's very many places where it would be possible to spend 4 weeks traveling down the river and get the kinds of encounters or experiences that I was able to find along the Magdalena. The Magdalena is a hugely, I keep using the word diverse, but in just every aspect, it's a special place. Not only today in the kinds of people who, if you read the book, you'll see, I mean, everybody from conservationists who are trying to solve this problem of invasive hippopotamuses that have taken over a stretch of the river, to an elderly man who weaves silver filigree jewelry on his front stoop for 77 years, even though nobody's around to buy his jewels. Colombia is so rooted in history, and the Magdalena is a central part of that history. People call it the fluvial artery of a country, which I like because it really is, it pumps the blood of a nation, and that's in many different ways, I think. That through this history of this country that's been mired in conflict for more than half a century now, it was a way to understand a very complex place in a way that I hope is digestible and understandable to an audience that maybe doesn't know very much about Latin America or Colombia at all. Yeah,
well, I can assure anyone who has not read the book that it is not just digestible, but compelling. It's they're just wonderful, wonderful stories. And a few minutes ago, I looked over with a look in my eye and told to me to say something. And what I just remembered was that one of the things he told me when he was in my class, and I'm not sure how it came up, he said, well, you know about the hippopotamuses in Colombia. I said, what are you talking about? It's crazy. And he told me the story, and it's crazy. Tell us the story.
It is a crazy story, and it's also a complicated story, but essentially, when Pablo Escobar, who's somebody who I really try to mention pretty sparsely in this book, and that's a deliberate decision, because I think he dominates so much of Colombia's coverage in the world. But anyway, he had a zoo, a private zoo, when he was in his heyday. And among the exotic animals that he had in the zoo were hippopotamuses that he'd imported from Africa. And when he was killed in the mid-90s, there were 4 hippopotamuses, and they escaped to a tributary of the Magdalena and started to reproduce. Today, it's estimated that there are at least 100 wild invasive hippopotamuses living. It's the only population of the animal that lives outside of the continent of Africa in the Magdalena River and its surroundings. Now, what does this mean? I think a lot of times when this story is reported, I would say 98% of the news reports that you'll see about these hippopotamuses, and they are covered really widely, are written by people who have never even been close to this place or to them, because they're treated as this kind of cartoonish, crazy story, which again, it is a crazy story, but it doesn't mean that it's entirely a laughing matter. When I went with again, biologists and community leaders looking for these hippopotamuses, and there they were, like distance from me to Ian, in the river. I spoke with fishermen who were chased off of their land by hippopotamuses, people who threw their nets in the water and, were worried that the hippos would rock their boats. These are aggressive and dangerous animals, and it's really changing life in these small towns along the river in a way that if they proliferate more and more and more, which it seems that they're doing, there could be thousands of them in 50 years. And what does that mean for the many people who live along this river? It's a very complicated question, and I do not have the answer to it.
No, I would think
Neither
not.
do the people I met.
I don't think anybody, yeah, right, nobody does. And of course, when you think about it for 2 seconds, the environment in Colombia is not that different from the environment in Africa.
They love it.
Right. They love the temperature, they love the water. And you say you saw them.
Yeah, right there were 2 hippopotamuses wallowing in the shallows right in front of me, and at that moment, the boat's motor got stuck in the sediment of the river, which is another big piece of this story, is that this river has been so plundered and pillaged over the years that it's not navigable anymore in many stretches because it's so shallow. So even the small outboard motor canoe that we were riding in, the motor got stuck in the mud at the bottom of the river, right in front of me were these 2 hippopotamuses that then slowly turned their heads and bared their teeth. And it was just really a harrowing thing. Then we sped away very quickly.
Right, and for those who don't know, in Africa, the hippopotamuses are responsible for many more deaths than any other animal, including lions. Maybe not mosquitoes with malaria, but they're fierce, they're aggressive. I learned this when my wife came back from Africa and told me about it. And who knew? Nobody here thinks of them that way.
Right.
So you talk about the river being much more shallow, silted up, I guess. Does that have to do with damming?
It has to do a little bit with damming, but it has more to do with deforestation along the banks of the river.
Okay.
Because there's a lot of plants that hold the sediment and the land in, and then when those plants were eradicated for pastures and for the boilers of the steamships and all sorts of things over the years, the land just poured into the river.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that's that. And so it clearly let me ask you this: it's clearly there's a mix of people along this river, ranging from people whose ancestors have lived there for generations, centuries, and people who are relative newcomers. Are the newcomers mostly the people who cut down the trees and okay?
No, so this river has a long and kind of storied history, and initially when it was in its golden age, as it is said, this was a river that shuttled on steamboats these passengers from the capital to the coast. So writers like Garcia Marquez would write about the Magdalena as this just, river of gold, they called it. But over the years, that river of gold became a river that was then exploited. And it's been a long process of exploitation. There's still very much deforestation, illegal mining, and all sorts of environmental problems that are happening along the river. But what caused it to lose its navigability, that was back in the 60s or 70s. Now, as you mentioned, there are lots of different kinds of people living along the river. But the newcomers, at least the vast majority of the newest comers that I found while I was there, were migrants from Venezuela. So neighboring Venezuela in Colombia is undergoing a huge economic, political, social crisis, causing a mass exodus of people. And a lot of those people have ended up living in Colombia and settling in towns along the river. And in one small town where I was, called Estación Cocorná, I spent a considerable amount of time with a large extended family of Venezuelan migrants and learned about what they are doing for a living. And most of them work on farms or work on the railroad or do other kinds of odd jobs in town. And I think that in general in Colombia, the environmental catastrophes that are ongoing are mega projects and larger scale problems of like ranching and mining.
And again, you hear about that with respect to Brazil,
but Colombia has, I think it's the third largest chunk of Amazon forest in South America. So,
I had a question. I know I did. So tell us a little bit about logistics. How does somebody just show up in Colombia, go to the headwaters of this amazing river, and just find people to talk to?
Yeah, I mean, well, Princeton is helpful in this way, and I was very lucky to be able to do this first as my thesis research, which then was expanded and adapted into the book that's out today. But Princeton was helpful in that I was generously funded, and I had resources available to me that I think other people would not necessarily have if they were doing this kind of project. But the way that I did it was in the same way that I first stayed with Sandra's 96-year-old grandmother in Cali, I created what I like to call a line of trust down this river. In each place, I was traveling alone, but there was somebody who was receiving me, whether it was a family in their home or a public librarian or a teacher. There was always somebody who I felt like I knew I could trust because they knew somebody who knew somebody who knew me. And in that way, those people were key to this project because they provided the branching out that was necessary for me to then have these more serendipitous encounters like the filigree jeweler or the hippopotamus biologists, right? But that was how the logistics happened. But a lot of people also ask, did I travel by boat? And for reasons why we've already discussed, that's really hard now. There are certain stretches of the river where you can travel by small, fast ferry, but by and large, you have to travel by land. And that was something I was thinking about a lot when I was working on the beginnings of this project, because I was thinking, what does that mean? that so many of the stories of this river throughout history have been written by people from the perspective of a boat that floats down and looks out. Whereas I would be forced through the very communities that were being written about instead of being centered in the narrative as they are here. And I think that though obviously the circumstances of why I had to travel by land were very sad, it was a privilege for me to be able to spend such considerable amounts of time with the people living along its banks. So I traveled by everything from a pickup truck, like hanging on the back, like the roof rack of a pickup truck, which was actually the passage that I read about here in Labyrinth, was hanging on the back of the pickup truck, if you remember. I rode on the backs of mules. I rode on this thing called a motobalinera, the railroad thing. This is the craziest. There's so many small details that are just very much up my alley, which is maybe why I like this river. But basically, the motobalinera is this wooden platform that is affixed with railroad wheels. It's like the same wheels on a train. And what people do is they put them on railroad tracks and they use a motorcycle to power this like cart through the railroad. And in some cases, the tracks are abandoned, but in other cases, like a freight train could come barreling down. And they literally told me when I got on this thing in a plastic chair, like not too different from the ones that you're sitting on, like folding chairs on this motobalinera, they said, if the train comes, jump. And this is, the train didn't come because I'm here, but I wonder like how that's dealt with. I've heard rumors that like some people are like in contact with the freight train companies so they know when it's coming, so it's on schedule and they can keep it safe. But some were done with motorcycles, some were done with like people were using oars to like row the railroad cart down the tracks. I think it speaks to, in the same way that the hippopotamuses speak to legacies of war and conflict and violence, the motobalinera and other elements like it speak to the kind of innovation and ingenuity that is necessary in places that just have such limited resources to get by. In what world is it most convenient to affix railroad wheels to a wooden platform, power it with a motorcycle down a stretch of railroad track where a freight train could come and run you over at any time? It's because people have to. And I think that that's an important element of this book. And something that I hope it explains well, and you will, I guess, be the judge of that, is there are certain descriptions that I hope are revealing, maybe sometimes even without saying it, of the very real aspects of life on the ground in an ever-changing country.
That is what makes this so compelling. These sort of these details that really illuminate what it's like to live in a place like this that is so unfamiliar to most of us.
Can I give another example? Is that okay?
You could give two.
Okay, great. I only had one, but there was a small town where I showed up after a 2-hour journey, hanging on the back of a pickup truck, and then a mule ride for like an hour and a half, called Quinchana and Magdalena, which is a kind of like offshoot hamlet of it. And in all of these places, the homes doubled as general stores. So you'd walk into a very small family home, and you'd see that in one room there's the bed where the whole family would sleep, and a kitchen maybe in another room. And then in the living room, instead of couches or chairs or anything like that, there were glass cabinets filled with goods. And if you looked at those goods, I think it's really revealing of what people need in a place where the state sometimes does not reach. You saw this assortment of items, everything from teddy bears to coloring books, feminine hygiene products, canned beans and lentils. So just the whole gamut of things that are needed in different ways in life. It says something. So just I hope by saying those kinds of items that are in a home that doubles as a general store, you can understand the kinds of places where this journey took me.
My father used to go down to South America every winter to teach summer school for a few weeks, teach physics. He went to Brazil first, which is my first trip to South America when I was 8 years old. And then he went a couple times to Argentina and Chile, but mostly to Uruguay, where, as many people know, but I didn't until he told me that the indigenous population is complete. There's absolutely no indigenous people there. Are there in Colombia still?
Yes, very much yes. And so many different groups. The language diversity of the indigenous groups of Colombia is spectacular. And I think there's a really strong element of community when it comes to indigenous peoples in different parts of Colombia. Right now, one of the big issues that's kind of plaguing the country is that activists and what they call social leaders, so community leaders of all kinds, but largely indigenous and Afro-Colombian people who are kind of defending the land or protesting for land rights or feminist activists are being killed by armed groups who have come in and vacated the land that have come into the land that was vacated by the FARC, which was the largest guerrilla group in Colombia, that was demobilized in 2016 with a peace deal that was signed. And so in looking at that issue in terms of how the indigenous communities feel like they have this moment to reclaim the land and the heritage that has been there. I don't actually know the situation in Uruguay, but I know in Argentina there are large pockets of indigenous peoples. And in Latin America, they're hugely important part of society. Their languages form a huge part of what you hear in the streets. Right. So it's a really beautiful thing.
Right. So we had a little conversation before this event, just to get an idea of what we're talking about. And Jordan told me that for some reason he doesn't understand, people are really interested in his own family background. And I told him, I understand. So tell us about it. And what relation does it have to this project, if any?
If any. No, so I do think that it is related to this project, but I think more broadly it's related to the question of why I am interested in doing something like this. Because I think that to your earlier question of how does somebody here in New Jersey end up writing about a river in like the Magdalena, I'm not Colombian. I made that very clear throughout the book. And this book is by and large for and about Colombian people who I met along the way. I was born and raised in the suburbs of New York, but my family kind of comes from everywhere. So my mom was born in Iraq, my dad's family is from Argentina, and before that from Syria. And I think as a result, I kind of grew up hearing these stories in a mix of English mainly, but also kind of tinges of Spanish and Arabic. These stories about a kind of wandering family across continents and oceans that has, for whatever reason, be it persecution or political strife or economic opportunity, kind of found its way to every corner of the world. And at the beginning of my kind of writing life, I think it was in high school when I was really I was thinking that I wanted to preserve those kinds of stories that I would hear from people in my family, because I noticed that as the older people were getting older, those stories and cultures and heritages and traditions were leaving us and leaving this world. And I really wanted to work to preserve that. It was so important to me. That was when I first started writing stories. And then when I got to Princeton, I think took several classes, including John McPhee's class, your courses by others in the journalism and creative writing departments. I realized that not only could it be writing could be a way to rediscover my family's past, but it could be a way to harness this now very privileged ability to move because I want to move in terms of going to other places, to tell stories about the world in a more globally interesting and outward-facing way. So, there are kind of vestiges of my own family's story along the Magdalena, which was definitely a cool thing to find, but it wasn't a reason for why I went. I think that more generally, my family background has given me this gift of the curiosity of places like the Magdalena that maybe are a little misunderstood, because I feel like what I've been transmitted from older people in my family is that they're misunderstood for different reasons.
And I think I remember that you mentioned that the people of Colombia were a bit amused by your Argentinian accent in Spanish.
Yes. I speak a very weird accent in Spanish because it was not the language of my house growing up. Like, we very much spoke English. And I only really started speaking it fluently once I started learning it in public school and then in college. So I speak like an Argentinian accented Spanish with an American twinge, which I see people nodding here because they've heard me speak Spanish before. And also I know some of you in the audience have the similar experience of growing up in the United States, but having family from Latin America and having to deal with that. Actually, though, that worked extremely to my advantage because on a trip like this, questions of identity come up all the time. Everywhere I would go, people would ask the first questions: who are you? Where do you come from? What is your name? Because these are names that aren't common necessarily in other places. And in answering those questions, I then maybe a little bit started to answer those questions for myself. In certain contexts, people thought of me as Argentinian. And maybe for the first time, this was especially that first trip when I was a freshman in school, that was really the first time that I thought of myself as Argentinian, ever. Because I would show up and people would make fun of my accent, basically, and yeah, it was really a special moment for me. But then in other ways, I was very much American, because I am American. And so I think that having this ability to like pull from these different identities while on the road allows for connections with people in ways that maybe if I was just one simple thing and it was easy to explain, it wouldn't start the kinds of conversations that could lead to the encounters that occur in this book.
Okay. So at some point we have to let people ask questions from the audience. My last question for you though,
Sure.
Unless nobody has a question, they'll keep talking, which you don't want. What's the next book project? Or don't you know? Or don't you want to tell?
I know, but I shouldn't really talk about it
Okay.
quite yet.
All right.
But it is more of a family-based story, is what I would say. And it also takes place in Latin America,
Okay.
and I'm very excited.
All right, good. Well, so mark your calendars. He's coming back to talk about the new book at some point here, I hope.
Okay, yeah, we're gonna open it up to the floor here and anyone online, so just raise your hand if you got a question here. Anybody? Come on, right, you're in the best, right?
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Victor. I'm curious, like now that like you wrote the book and it's sort of a finished project, how do you see your relationship with the people who you talked to in Colombia and the community that you like sort of like reached out to them and like just wrote narrated their story? Like, what is your relationship as someone who presented their story now that you're done with it?
One of the beautiful things about a project like this in the world that we're living now is that you stay in touch in all ways of media with all these people. So they're not fleeting encounters by any means, which maybe in the past, these sorts of meetings would be because you can have no way of keeping in touch. But I've formed deep friendships with a lot of the people I met along this river and keep in very close contact. One of my big hopes with this book, it's unfortunately something that's out of my hands, is that it will be translated into Spanish. Because what I want more than anything else is for the people who are in this book to be able to read this book. I've done crude like Google Translate, fast copying and pasting chapters of the book and sending them to people. And by and large, they're very pleased and happy and honored to be in it. But I really hope that it could be translated into Spanish because I think that there are certain nuances to the story that will make more sense, like idioms in Colombian dialect of Spanish that I know they said when I was with them that will go into this Spanish translation when there is the time. But to your question about how my relationship has changed, I don't think that it's necessarily changed so much as it's just evolved very gradually. This book coming out has been, in a way, it's been a wonderful thing, but in other ways, like not much has changed necessarily because the book has been in the works for so long, and they all know that it's been in the works for so long. So I wish I kind of had a better answer to your question, but hopefully that gives some insight into the fact that, well, here's something that is relevant, is that because of keeping in touch with people over the course of, it's been 3.5 years since I traveled down the Magdalena, things change in my life and things have changed in other people's lives too. Sometimes these are tragic examples. In the book, I speak about one anthropologist who took me to the Andes in search of these ancient statues who was murdered a year after I met him. As part of this wave of activist killings in Colombia. In other cases, people have gotten degrees and jobs and their families have moved up in the socioeconomic ladder and it's been cause for celebration. And in other cases that haven't made it into the book, there have been some really, really terrible things that have happened to people who are still alive. And I think that going into that with people like I've noticed that people will reach out to me whenever any of those things happen, because we share this connection of like, maybe because I'm a little bit removed from the situation, they feel like there is a camaraderie that we can talk about these life changes for all of us in ways that are meaningful.
Thank you. Anyone else from here?
I just was curious about how you feel like you evolved as a journalist, like as a young writer myself, and how you feel like the journey affected you, and what you felt like maybe you learned or grew along the way.
Thank you for the most challenging question of them all. This book was written over a long period of time. Again, started out as my thesis and then turned into a book. So it's hard to say with this if there's one clear takeaway of what I learned, but I think that in the iterations of writing and rewriting this book, I learned a lot about developing a voice as a writer. I think that now especially, there's so much importance placed on the narrator being present. And that was something that I really shied away from for a long time, especially when it was my thesis here. But different professors, such as Christina, who's sitting right there, my thesis advisor, and others at the university, really encouraged me, especially near the end of the thesis project, to insert myself more, because it allows for a connection between the reader who may be completely removed from a certain topic to the topic itself. And I think that that has really become a constant in my other work, which is more than just the book. I mean, I write for different publications on a variety of subjects, as we mentioned. And in almost all of those cases, the reactions to the stories, both from editors and from the audience, has been more positive and, not more positive, but more connected, deeper, when the stories involve some aspect of this personal connection. So I think it's really important, and it's something that I've been uncomfortable with, I still am uncomfortable with. It's really hard to write about yourself, but it seems to be what people are reading.
Yeah.
That's one thing. Maybe it's because we're young writers and we don't have much experience, but that's just one of the small takeaways that I've had.
Thank you for your talk. It's fascinating. Have you been in contact, or anybody in the government? Have they read your book? Perhaps at the UN or the ambassador in Washington?
The American government or the Colombian?
Oh, the Colombian. And, what is the reaction of officials in Colombia?
This is such an exciting question. I have no idea. The book only came out like 10 days ago. So I hope that at some point people in the Colombian government will get a hold of it, because I think there's a lot of important things to be, I don't know, I shouldn't say important, because this is on the whole a small scale book. But my hope is that in these small scale everyday stories of regular people, perhaps some change can be enacted to make people's lives better. So my hope is that people in charge will read it, but I haven't gotten any indication that that's been the case just yet.
You have to send them a copy.
Maybe I should FedEx some copies of my book to them. Yeah, you're right. In the reporting of the book, they know that they don't pay attention to me, but I've interacted with the government in the reporting of this book and in the reporting of stories that are related to the book. I think that they have a little bit too much going on to be paying attention to me, but maybe that will change when I mail them a copy. I thought that's a good suggestion. Thank you for the question.
Hi, Jordan. I know you had many professors at Princeton, many writing mentors, but I think it might be interesting to know that, or to find out from you, John McPhee, so much of John McPhee's work is centered in place, and he immerses himself in these different places and then writes about them. I was wondering if you could share something that you've learned from John about writing about place that you feel changed you as a writer, and that you leaned into in this book
Yeah. Well, for those of you who don't know, John McPhee is a longtime professor here and also maybe the most legendary nonfiction writer that there is. He's someone I look up to tremendously. And his class was actually what turned me on to this kind of writing in the first place. Because before that, I knew that I wanted to write things, but I wasn't quite sure what kind of a writer I wanted to be. I thought maybe I wanted to write for television, but then realized that I wasn't very good at that, and it wasn't really what I was interested in. I tried taking fiction classes, actually wrote about Colombia for a class with Joyce Carol Oates, and it's so funny because she's read this book, and the first chapter is almost word for word a submission of mine as a short fictional story to her class that I just like changed the names and pretended that it was fake. In reality, it was all true. And I didn't necessarily realize that you could write a true story that had narrative and that had this value of both entertainment and fact and information until I took John's class. In John's class, the assignments were varied, and I think that in every case we was paired with a piece of writing of his. And it was also the first time that I discovered him as a writer. Now he's one of my favorite writers. And I think that just by reading John's work, everything from stories about oranges to canoe trips in Maine, to journeys in Georgia. He wrote a whole book, well, I shouldn't say that. He wrote a long piece called Travels in Georgia that we read, which was really, really eye-opening and special. But also the kinds of assignments that he would have us do. For the class, I remember that I wanted to write a story about people who go fishing on Lake Carnegie in Princeton, which is a very polluted lake from what I understand, but there were people there always who I knew from walking and running on the towpath and hearing from other people, that they were fishing this lake and eating the fish that were coming out of the lake. So at John's encouragement, I one day left his class with a fishing rod in my backpack and went to Lake Carnegie and started fishing with these guys at this lake. And all of this is to say that John taught me that having experiences with people is just as important, if not more important, than writing about people. John is the kind of, from his stories you can see, he immerses himself in the lives and in the places of the people and places that he writes about. And I think that he being my first introduction to this on the whole, I just tried to emulate what I saw was this kind of masterful work. And yeah, that was just really inspiring to me, that I could spend time with interesting and brilliant people for my job, and then writing about them being the work that is produced from that learning experience. Because at the end of the day, it just is this learning experience. It's really special, so. Does that answer? Yeah.
I think we have time for just a couple more. Oh, well, I have just actually a quick one for you too. So you mentioned like the line of trust up and down the river that you formed with various people, and I it's not being a journalist myself. How do you go into a project like this? I mean, maybe did you know you had these safe havens or these little anchor points of ingress, and also as someone, I mean, this is a journalistic work for the most part. As someone who wants to do that kind of journalism, how do you start those? How do you gain those?
How do you gain those connections?
Yes,
Yeah.
feeding to others.
For reasons related to my own desire to be safe on this journey and Princeton's desire for me to be safe on this journey, I was very deliberate about who these people were going to be in each place, and the connections came from everything from there's a Princeton graduate in Bogota who works at a university, and he connected me with a librarian in a town called San Agustin, who then connected me with Luis Manuel Salamanca, the anthropologist, who then suggested that maybe I stop by this canoe builder in Neiva. And anyway, little by little, like, it was a combination of having people expecting me and having people suggest, oh, next you're going to Barranca Bermeja? You can't miss the Hotel Pipaton, the grandest hotel of them all, which is closing, by the way, for good tomorrow. And so that's how I stumbled upon this story that I never would have expected to come across. Yeah, but I think that it all comes back to this energy of, or not energy, but willingness to just keep your ears open for anything. and being willing to ask those questions and follow those leads as much as possible, because you never know what you will come across or what somebody will say that will then lead you onto an entirely different path for running.
All right, thank you, yes, excellent. Maybe one more? We got?
We get one more question after this wonderful round of people.
Maybe this isn't the most interesting question that you'll receive, but we talked a little bit about 4 weeks kind of being this set journey time. I guess I was curious how the story might have changed both in detail, scope, and feel if it had been half as long or maybe twice as long. Would that have dictated, probably would have dictated what you've written about, what would have changed what you focused on story-wise and feel-wise?
I wonder too, it's a hard thing to consider. I don't think that it could have been done in less time, just because of the nature of the logistics and being able to cover the 950 miles of the river in the kind of depth that I wanted to, in the amount of time that I had. The only reason that it was 4 weeks is because I was still in school and I had to time it with other, like coming back to college. But I think that had I had more time, I don't know that it would have helped me. Because I think that one of the things about this book that makes it, again, I use the word digestible, maybe that's not the right word, maybe compelling to an audience that would pick this up not knowing anything about the subject or the place, is that it occurred in the amount of time that somebody like me, who also had really not much of an introduction to the place, was able to have this immersive experience in a way that was meaningful, but also not too much time where I would be overwhelmed with material and have to leave so many things out that I would, that it would be to the detriment of the book. So in the end, 4 weeks was a coincidence, but it was the right amount of time, I think. There have been maybe it would have been a different book if it was longer. It would have been more of it would be longer and it would be more, I don't know, this is very much one young person's journey down the river. And I think that has its own value in ways, I hope at least. And I think that's probably because of the time spent.
All right, thank you so much. I would like to just join us all and thank you again, Jarvis and Alvin.